You're watching the award-winning GHS-TV, a nationally recognized student television station.
His rise to Broadway was as unlikely as it was unusual. Born in Pittsburgh, 1945. His father white, his mother black. He started out a poet, but came to be recognized as one of the most important playwrights of the 20th century. Unapologetically devoted to his art, uncompromisingly grounded in the belief that ordinary black life was ennobled with gifts of blood, of memory, of history. He would create an epic body of work, 10 plays that would go on to win a Tony Award, 2 Pulitzers, launch the careers of countless actors, and earn the honor of having a Broadway theater named after him. His birth name was Frederick August Kittle, but to the world, he was known as August Wilson.
August Wilson's birthday is coming up next month. He was born on April 27th. So for those of us who are August Wilson scholars, that's the day that we celebrate his birth. We also mourn his death because he died shortly before his birthday, about a decade ago. But when he died accomplishing several American dramatic literary tasks. One of those being is that August Wilson is the first and the only African-American playwright to have a theater named for him on Broadway. And for any of you who are members of the wonderful productions here at Germantown High School, if you understand the idea and the significance of theater and cultural arts, that is huge. So I know many of you have been to Broadway, but if you ever go there, this is the only person of color whose name is in lights. It was the former Virginia Theater. Now, how does this person who's August Wilson, whose Fences that you read, how did he come to be? It's a very interesting story, and actually it encompasses a library, and also it talks about education. Wilson was born, first of all, in the Pittsburgh Hill District, and the Pittsburgh Hill District is located literally like up on a hill outside of, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was born into a really, really diverse community, which as his niece and who's a fellow August Wilson scholar and also a good friend of mine always tells me when she comes to Memphis, it reminds her a lot of Memphis, particularly the way Memphis used to look with the Pinch District. So any of you all are familiar with the Pinch District. Wilson grew up in this extremely diverse community. His mother, Daisy Wilson, was a domestic who migrated from the south to the north to the Pittsburgh Hill District, and his father was a German baker who remained with the family kind of off and on. He was an excellent baker, but one of his faults, and this is one of these ideas that manifests itself in Fences, was that he struggled with alcoholism. So when we think about Troy and we think about his weekly ritual, Wilson is, and I'm going to give you all many hints how he's reincorporating or kind of re-putting his own biographical story in Fences along with the other plays. So August Wilson was actually born Frederick August Kittle. That was his birth name, K-I-T-T-L-E. He changed his name to August Wilson after his father abandoned the family. After he grew up, his mother remarried, and he took on the surname of his stepfather because he saw his stepfather as being more of a father figure for him than his biological father. Frederick August Kittle, though, August Wilson, Frederick August Kittle, who becomes August Wilson, has a really interesting story after that. He, just like you all, brilliant scholar, but he didn't like school. He was educated in the Catholic school system in the Pittsburgh Hill District, and when he was 15 years old, he left school. Now, he didn't leave school because he wasn't a good student. He didn't leave school because of problems at home. He left school because of an exchange with a teacher. He wrote a paper on Napoleon Bonaparte. And you know how sometimes when you write that paper and it's the paper that you find, the topic that you love and the person you want to write, you write your best paper, right, Jack? You write your best paper. So he writes this brilliant paper on Napoleon Bonaparte, and his teacher called him in. He said, "I'll give you a D if you admit that you didn't write this paper because it's too good." And young August at the time said, "No, I wrote this paper." So his teacher said again, "No, you didn't write this paper." And he was saying that because of the way that Wilson acted in class. He acted as though he were unenthused. He didn't care about education. And so Wilson said, "No, sir, I wrote this paper." And so he said, "Well, since you want to admit that you wrote this paper, I'm going to give you an F, or that you didn't write this paper." So that day, August Wilson walked out of high school. And he never returned. Well, he did return. He returned the next day, but he didn't go into the building. Instead, what this man who writes this great play Fences, who's going to have a theater named for him on Broadway, does, he goes outside and he plays basketball in front of his principal's window and his teacher's window, and no one ever invited him back into the building. Now, the story continues where Wilson couldn't tell his mother that he quit school. So instead, what he would do, he would get up every morning and pretend as though he were going to school, and he would go down to the Pittsburgh library. He would sit in what was called the Negro section and read from 8 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the morning. So he read every book that he could until his mother found out that he quit school. You know, it wasn't going to take long for mom to figure out something's not right here. I'm not seeing a report card. I don't see any homework. When his mother found out that he had quit school, what she told him was, "You know what, you need to get a job." So what he started doing was working as a short order cook and as a maintenance man in bars and grills around Pittsburgh. So he's this young man coming of age. He's not in school, but he's getting, as he called, the best education he ever learned, because he's listening to the voices of these other men and women who are frequenting these establishments where he's working. Now, he doesn't realize the rich nature of this education he's getting until much later in his life. But he's storing these stories that he's hearing about these individuals like Troy and like Rose, coming from their own mouths, about what it was like to migrate from the South to the North and what life has been like for them. So I want to use that as a way to introduce you all to, or remind you all of certain ideas that you've already encountered and discovered in Fences. First is the idea of the Great Migration. And historians, scholars, sociologists, cultural theorists, the Great Migration is known as that migration, this mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North following the Civil War. Now, the thing about the Great Migration that I like students to make certain is to understand it wasn't just one major movement. There were several movements that took place. The first Great Migration actually preceded North American and South American slavery, and that was the transatlantic slave trade. And as Morgan mentioned, the next text I'm working on is August Wilson, Joe Turner's Come and Gone, which talks about, alludes to that particular moment. The Great Migration that Wilson centers on, particularly when we hear Troy talk about his life in Alabama before coming up to Pittsburgh, is the Great Migration that most people know about. And this is migration, not necessarily the one immediately after slavery, but the one maybe about 10, 20 years later, when people from the South who were sharecropping at this time began migrating, walking en masse to the North in search of better jobs and a better life, and what they assumed was going to be a better, I guess you say, cultural experience. Now, and I know I didn't ask Ms. Jackson to have you all do it, but so if you have your book, pull out your book, but if you don't, let me remind you all to go back in your book and look at the way Wilson, I guess you could say, prologues Fences. And that is that section called The Play, okay? So I'll read it for those of you all who don't have it, but for those of you all who, make sure you write this down, because this may be something that you can use later, particularly as you're writing these next wonderful papers. Remember in that portion called The Play, this is before we get into the action of the play itself, Wilson takes time as an artist to give you this cultural context to understand what is going on. And I'll only read a little bit from it because I don't want to bore you all with reading from it, but I want you to understand how he sets an understanding about what it means to be a migrant, what it means to be a Troy Maxon, what it means to be an individual in this place. And I'll read that middle paragraph where he writes, "The descendants of African slaves were offered no such welcome or participation. They came from places called the Carolinas and the Virginias." Remember, his mother came from North Carolina. "Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee," which is why I love teaching Wilson, because he mentions so much about the Tennessee migrants' experience in his work that most Wilson scholars don't pick up because most of them aren't Southern. "They came strong, eager, and searching. The city rejected them, and they fled and settled along the riverbanks and under bridges in shallow, ramshackle houses made of sticks and tar paper. They collected rags and wood. They sold the use of their muscles and their bodies. They cleaned houses and washed clothes. They shined shoes, and in quiet desperation and vengeful pride, they stole and lived in pursuit of their own dream, that they could breathe free finally and stand to meet life with the force of dignity and whatever eloquence the heart could call upon." He uses that to set us up and move us into the Troy, into the Maxon space that we meet in 1957. So this is the cultural landscape that he enriches his plays with, that he enriches Fences with, that he wants his readers and viewers to understand psychologically, socially, culturally, economically, what creates an individual who does some of the things that Troy does. And I can't wait to see how you all reacted. What did you think? Because you understand why he does these things. And that's one of the ways that Wilson creates this work. The next metaphor, or the next idea that I think you should focus on, and that is the blues trope. Because what informs and shapes Fences is this blues lyricism, is this idea of the blues. So let's talk about what the blues is and how the blues features in the Fences, and how Wilson demonstrates over and over through Troy's character, through Troy's language, not only the blues trope, not only a blues aesthetic, but makes us understand, in a sense, and I'll come to this at the end, how significant understanding this particular musical genre is to understanding the American story. Now, how many of you all have heard of the blues being considered an example of the African-American vernacular tradition? The term vernacular literally translates into originating in one's own house. Now, I want to make certain you all hold on to that, because the blues tradition, or the blues trope, or the blues aesthetic, the way Wilson uses it, actually features and talks about the African-American vernacular tradition. He's talking about those not only speech patterns, but those ideas, that sense of orality, or the expression of oral tradition that emerged from the African-American cultural experience. Now, going back to the Great Migration, as I said, many people left also during the sharecropping period, right? And sharecropping in this period is this period after American slavery, when now individuals who were formerly enslaved actually work oftentimes on the same plantations where they work, and they work for pennies on the dollar. Or another way we call it in my particular study, oftentimes they worked and they never got out of debt. It became another form of debt system. So you would work, you would pick so many bales of cotton, but you never picked enough cotton to get out of debt. So what you would do is you would trade your work, your muscles, your cotton picking for what they call scrip. And you all know what scrip is, right? Scrip is actually a form of, each kind of sharecropping agency or a former plantation had its own form of currency. So you would exchange it for scrip, and you would use the scrip to go and buy those things that you needed for your family, and to buy the seed for the following year. So you're planting a crop that you're selling, but you're never really making the pennies. Think about the idea of how sometimes a bad form of capitalism works, okay? So the sharecropping space is one of the spaces from which the idea of the blues and the blues music emerges from. Now remember, blues is considered one of the truest and most pure American art forms, right? Musical forms. And that's because it originated in the Mississippi Delta. It originated from individuals who didn't write their song lyrics down. They're speaking themselves into existence by singing about the pains and the pleasures of life. Early blues musicians created their own instruments. So we're not talking about people who go down to the Dixon, the guitar factory downtown, the Gibson factory, and make one. They made their own string instruments. They use old washboards. They use string that they made from sometimes the sinews of the muscles of the animals that they killed. And they created this musical art form that recollected and that held on to their understanding of the world. And this became the blues as it originated. Now, the blues trope found itself from the Mississippi Delta all over the nation, then all over the world. But first, as you all know well, it found itself and it stopped in our own locale of Memphis, Tennessee, right? We're in Germantown, but we're right down the street. Now, many people, and this is actually historically accurate, consider W.C. Handy the father of blues music. W.C. Handy, who has a statue down on Beale Street, who has a marker down on Beale Street, whose house is still on Beale Street at the very far end and that you can tour, is considered the father of the blues because W.C. Handy was the first to commercially publish blues music, like, the songs. He was the first to do that, and he did that on Beale Street. Now, Handy was actually a church musician before he became a blues musician. But if you all know anything about the whole evolution of music, most people began in the church and then moved into more secular genres, right? So he began as not only a preacher's son, but as a musician playing gospel music. And then he came up to Memphis. Memphis was Sin City then, and some people consider it Sin City now, right? I'm from Louisiana, so New Orleans is like Sin City for me. So I'm like, okay. But he comes up to Memphis and he hears this music, and it so inspires him to where he sets it down to music. He begins to make a business in the publishing of blues songs. So he not only helps to publish and transcribe and record, so I think you all hear the word I'm saying, recording a lot of history. He's recording these blues songs, but then he begins to capitalize on it because now the blues music is going to be sold, it's printed, it's going up to Chicago, it's going to Detroit, it's going to New York. It's going all over the places. So it's leaving the Delta and it's ushering a space for these musicians and their descendants and their proteges to do this type of work. So I guess you're thinking, well, Dr. Menson-Furr, what does this have to do with Troy? What blues song does Troy sing throughout Fences? Old Blue, right? All right. And we don't really get the full rendition of the song until the last act when the Maxon family has gathered to bury Troy, right? But Troy's song about Old Blue is probably part fact, probably part fiction. But it becomes a way for Troy to utilize blue as a figure. Think about the idea of putting blue in the space of a human being. Although blue was supposed to be real, but we don't really know because Troy hyperbolizes a whole lot through this particular play. But blue becomes that representation of the blues. Now, how did August Wilson in the Pittsburgh Hill District discover the blues? As I said, the blues moved with the sheet music, it moved with the radio, it moved with the migrants themselves who were coming from places in the South to the North. But Wilson actually discovered the blues happenstance. By this time, he's almost 20, in his 20s, a little bit older. He's moved out of his mother's house. He has renting a room, so not an apartment, renting a room in a boarding house. Has a little money from his job as a short order cook, and he goes down to the thrift store. Wilson bought a stack of 45s and a record player. Got back to his room, and he just randomly picked the first one off of the shelf, off the top, and put it on the record player. The song that he picked up, and this is how I love teaching literature and how things just come to you and like, wait a minute. The song he picked up, interestingly enough, you all, was Bessie Smith's "Nobody Can Shake a Sweet Jelly Roll Like Mine." So it's, blues songs are all over the place, He says that he listened to that song. Sometimes he said he listened to it for 25 times straight. Sometimes he said he listened to it 45 times. It depends on which interview you use. But he was so mesmerized by what he heard that he said for the first time he really heard and understood those voices that he heard when he was cleaning up in the bars and grills. He was understanding what this black idea about life and culture was. And just as an aside, why I'm so excited when I talk about Bessie Smith, you know Bessie Smith was a native of Nashville, Tennessee. So we have yet another Tennessee blues connection that I want you all to hold on to. So he listened to this song multiple times, and he said it so influenced him till it made him understand what it was that he thought he didn't understand. For the first time, he said he realized that the Black American culture had a voice. Now, Wilson uses this blues trope, and it's going to become not only the basis of Fences and the other plays that I'll talk about very briefly in a little bit, but it becomes the basis first of his first artistic endeavors. August Wilson was a poet before he was a playwright. And if any of you all are poets, you can look at the language that's used in this play and see the poetic nature of it. Even when I read that excerpt from the play, it's so poetically written. The way he uses metaphor and simile and imagery, that's different in many ways than many playwrights, because he's using his skills that he self-developed as a poet, first developed as a poet, and then he translates them into playwriting. Now, from blues, then to the poetic field, then to playwriting, Wilson creates a continuous journey to creating what Fences is going to become a part of. He planned, plotted, and completed what he considered a 400-year-old African-American autobiography. Now let me pause there. Fences is set in what year again? 1957, right? Fences is one of 10 plays that August Wilson composed depicting one decade or each decade in the 20th century of the African-American experience. So Fences is the play that's set during the decade of the 1950s. Now, Fences concludes about 8 years later. So what, 1965, right? So when Fences concludes, we move into the era that's most known oftentimes as the Civil Rights Movement, although the Civil Rights Movement actually began before the 60s. But for many people's purposes, they see it as the 60s. So it ends in the 60s, and what he does is that he writes a play that's set in the 60s called Two Trains Running. That's actually set following the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Now, what I'm trying to get at is that you all have the opportunity to read Fences, which is absolutely phenomenal. But Fences is the center of Wilson's 10-play dramatic canon. The first play in the dramatic canon is a play called Gem of the Ocean that's set during the first decade of the 20th century. Now, Gem of the Ocean was, interesting enough, one of the last plays that he wrote, but it's the play that begins his cycle. It's the play that's set roughly in 1904, and it talks about that experience right after slavery and right after the Civil War and right after the Reconstruction period. The second play is actually the play that Wilson becomes known for before Fences, and that is Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, Sankey, set in that play is set in the 1920s. Now, put a star by Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, because Ma Rainey's Black Bottom was not only the first play that gained August Wilson commercial success and actually set up for him to be able to write Fences, but it was the play that actually gained him access to Broadway. And Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, you all, is named for Bessie Smith's protege, Ma Rainey, Gertrude Ma Rainey, who was a blues singer. So Gertrude Ma Rainey taught Bessie Smith how to be a blues singer. So you all see this kind of blues ideology he's continuing, right? The third play chronologically, and I'm saying this chronologically, because he didn't write these plays in this order, but he wrote them and then he realized he had this series. The third play set in the 1930s is The Piano Lesson, which up until the production of Fences was the only August Wilson play that had been adapted to film. Now, this is oftentimes the one that I used to teach when I was teaching when Morgan was small, because it was the only one that I could utilize in class because it was a film. But this play is set in the Hill District also. It follows the lives of a family that migrated even closer to us than in Alabama, but from Sunflower County, Mississippi, from the Mississippi Delta. The play that is between that, so the decade of the 40s as we get to the 50s, is a play called Seven Guitars. which is a play that literally is an ensemble play that features 7 blues characters. Then we get Fences, set in the 1950s, in 1957. Now I'm going to stop there and I'll conclude at the end and tell you all a little bit about the other plays that follow Fences, because it was actually because of Ma Rainey's Black Bottom that Wilson wrote first that Fences is able to be written. Now the way that story goes is that Wilson was determined not to be a one-time playwright. He was also determined, I know some of you all, like when somebody gives you a challenge, that's when you work best to meet the challenge. He was determined to silence the critics, because the critics contended that he couldn't write a really uniform Aristotelian drama. They thought, okay, new voice, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom is a great play. It deals with the idea of, you know, music and blues musicians. Actually, when they staged it on Broadway, they tried to stage it as a musical, but he refused to allow them to do it because it wasn't a musical, it was a drama. So he gets this dare and he decides, you know what? I can write a real Aristotelian drama. And he does so. He writes this play, and not only does he challenge and meet the critics' challenges, but he writes a play, you all, that continues to be one of the most anthologized, produced, and directed plays, not only in America, but in the nation. Fences has been staged in Japan. Fences has been staged in West Africa. Fences has been staged in Europe. And the reason why Fences has been staged in these 3 plays is because of not only the idea that Wilson is telling a story, that he's talking about the African American culture, that he's talking about blues music, but more importantly, especially for the sake of this discussion, is because people read Fences and they recognize the universality of these characters. So if we took away all the cultural nuances about this specific group, although Wilson would not want us to, and I'll tell you why in a minute, you can take Fences and it can be duplicated in another culture. The father-son battle is not just germane to African American culture, right? The idea of marital conflict is not just germane to African American culture. The idea of someone wanting a different life is not just germane to American culture, right? So what we have is this idea of Wilson using, as he calls, he takes the specific in order to preach and to show the universal. That's why people all over the world, all over the nation can read Fences, and even when they don't want to, they find themselves in the work. Now, it's not difficult to do if you allow yourself to realize what the other lesson that Wilson wants people to get from Fences, and that is that all human experience matters. Does that make sense? So Troy is not just, as we see, a person who's flawed in one culture. Troy is flawed in another culture. And I hope Ms. Jackson doesn't mind, but you all are about to read another work that actually Fences is always compared to. And you'll note why it's compared to that. That's my biggest hint I'm giving you. I'm not gonna say anything else, okay? Because I don't want to spoil it. So we have the foundation. We understand why Fences is celebrated. We understand why you all get the opportunity to read Fences. Fences wasn't written when I was in high school. Fences was written when I was in graduate school. So that's how I discovered August Wilson as a voice. That's how he became the subject of my dissertation and all the work I've been doing for the last 20 years. So when Ms. Jackson invited me to come, I was like, oh my goodness, I've talked about Fences. I thought I put Fences down 8 years ago when I finished the book on Fences. I did not want to talk about Fences, not for Ms. Jackson's sake, but you know, then the movie came out and everybody started calling the guy. Like the day the movie came out on Christmas, my phone rang off the hook and we were in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. And everyone's like, did you see it? Have you seen it? I'm like, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to do it. You get pulled back into it because it's part of that universality. It's the fact that Fences sold out, I heard, in Memphis. You couldn't get a seat. In New Smyrna Beach, I got the last seat in the theater at 9 o'clock in the showing. And the audience was just as diverse as this room. And everyone took some away from Bree just as you did. So, how does Fences then fit into this 400-year-old autobiography, the blues music, the African-American culture of the South? How does all of this work? How do we get all of this when we get to Troy and Lions and Corey and Rose and Raynell, and then the spectacle character, Gabriel. All of this works in the way that Wilson wants to make certain, and these are things I have already told you all, that individuals understand about how life and how human beings, and particularly about how families work. Now, let's go back to what I said about the idea of Wilson attempting to, and actually meeting the challenge posed by critics about writing a great Aristotelian drama with all the unities and actually a drama that's written around one central character. So when you talk about that first power, if I can say the first layer of that power dynamic, Troy is the center of power because what Wilson has created is a Lear-like, a King Lear-like character. Everything revolves around Troy. Now, I specifically use a Shakespearean reference because Wilson is considered by some to be the African-American Shakespeare, because like Shakespeare, his chronicle plays, and I only got to Fences for you all and I stopped, is very similar to his history plays. So hold on to that connection too. But back to this sense of power. Now, the irony of the idea of saying Troy Maxson is the person in power is that it's 1957. No, it's not Memphis, Tennessee. No, it's not Germantown, Tennessee, but it's the Pittsburgh Hill District. Troy is, as Wilson even says in the play, the prologue to the production, is Troy is free, but Troy is still controlled by certain factors, right? One of those factors being Troy is a sanitation worker. And as an African-American sanitation worker, Troy has to work where? On the back of the truck, right? Although that changes within the course of the play. So we have this idea of that power dynamic already there, Sean, where Troy is powerless. He can go and ask the question and demand that people give him an answer, which he does get an answer to, and he gets the new position. Am I correct? But at the same time, because of that particular component, Troy is there. Let's talk about the idea about the life side idea of power. Economics. How has Troy acquired the home, which is an example of the American dream? Gabriel's VA money, right? Is he proud of the fact that, as he says, he had to swoop down on Gabriel's VA money to get this house? No, he isn't. However, a system is in place that forces him to have to manipulate the system so that he can have a roof over his head and put one for his family, right? Because, and I'm thinking about, Fences begins in 1957. This is just an aside. Lorraine Hansberry is going to write the great American drama, A Raisin in the Sun, have it produced in 1959, right? Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun is about housing discrimination and who can buy houses where. So when Troy swoops down and can buy a house in the Pittsburgh Hill District by using Gabriel's money, you see it's not the fanciest house, right? It's a house so that he at least has a little bit of an edge that Hansberry is going to say her characters don't have, although they do have it, but they have to fight for it. So you see kind of the connection I'm making here about we're going from Pittsburgh to Chicago. We're talking about a universal experience of who can buy a house and how they can buy a house. Troy is not always in power, is he? Who else shares that space? Rose. The first time I read Fences, I kept thinking, wait a minute, this play is supposed to be about Troy Maxson, but Rose is just as powerful, right? Years went by, I wrote about Fences, and I could not get around the fact that this play is supposed to be about Troy, but Troy can't really exist without not only the other characters, but without Rose being like his perfect, his perfect counter, so to speak, right? I tried to write an article one time about August Wilson's women, and so many people have. And all of them have come back to Rose. Some people have argued that Rose is actually weak. Like, I don't know what play you read, because I didn't see that. But others have seen and have shared, I think Rose is just as powerful. And if I make a different aside, to be honest with you, that's one of the reasons why Viola Davis was able to sweep all the awards. Because for the first time, Rose had really been acknowledged and fully realized. Now, she was acknowledged and fully realized on the Broadway stage and even in scholarly writing, but when you have a larger filmic adaptation, you see an actress who shows Rose is just as powerful in her silent strength, that one thing we have to realize when it comes to lopsided politics, particularly when it comes to the idea of gender, is that oftentimes women are just as powerful even if we are silent. There is power in silence. Because when she finally does erupt, Troy's, going back to that first slide, Troy's blues is quelled. She doesn't want to hear all that foolishness, right? I don't want to hear that you've been stuck on second for 18 years. I've been stuck right with you, right? And I'm paraphrasing what she's telling him. So when they have their standoff, she asserts her authority, and then, of course, my favorite part still is when he brings Raynell home. I know you all can snicker because it's hard. I mean, I'm with 3 decades older than all of you all, and I still have a hard time with it. And last week I was at the library, the Memphis Hooks Library, giving a talk, the same talk, and it was an adult audience, so it was a whole lot more ruckus. Like, oh my goodness, I can't believe he did this, right? So when Troy comes home, not only not only telling her what he does, but then when he brings the baby home, that's when she puts her foot down. She doesn't leave her house. She doesn't leave her family. She still gets her fence too, doesn't she? But she's done with him. And that is an idea of saying, I'm still going to have everything that I set out for, but you are no longer going to have control over me, right? Let me get this one last thing about the idea of the power, because I love the fact that she went with that particular point first. At the play's conclusion, when now the estranged Corey returns home, and you all know why Corey leaves home. I mean, they have that final battle royale scene. And that's a huge scene that we want to go back and we want to discuss, because that is one of those pivotal moments that sealed the deal for fences, that made fences universal. But when Corey returns and he tells his mother that he's not going to his father's funeral, and she says, no, you're not going to do this today. And she tells him, you're just like him. But she also does something that's extremely powerful, particularly when we read fences through the lenses of gender or feminist studies. She says everything that Troy did, she allowed him to do. And if any of you all learn anything as you mature, one thing about life is that you have to own what you allow people to do to you. She says she allowed Troy to consume her, right? But the thing I love when she says, because that's what life offered me in being a woman. What Wilson didn't write, because he didn't have to, was that's what life offered her in the way of being a black woman, because for a black woman, Rose had a house. She didn't work. Every Friday, Troy brought home a sack of potatoes, his paycheck. She gave him his $6 back. And that was how this particular relationship worked. It was good. She had her family. And that's where we get back to the extended metaphor of the fence. And she finally got her fence too, because she wanted to keep everything in, because as she said, she didn't want any half-nothings in her house, right? Troy brought them, but she didn't want any of that. She wanted this family. When she tells him that, or when she makes that admission, that's when she's reclaiming her power yet again. I gave him my power. He didn't take it, I gave it to him. And now she's telling Corey, you need to realize that I admit to my fault in this, and we move on. You all see how that works? That's maturing, that's evolving. That's why we can have this 8-year saga of this one family and see how, and I love the way you put, they all are stubborn, they all want what they want. And ultimately they get what they want. It may take somebody stepping on someone, but at the end of the day, this is still a family. Now, just as an aside, because I know, again, you all are so brilliant, you study sociology, you study so many things that many of my students don't get to study until they get to college. What Milson does with fences, and even that power dynamic and this whole idea of who's in control and who isn't, an examination of this black family, is that he counters this report that was actually produced or published by the government called the Monahan Report. Have you all ever heard of the Monahan Report? The Monahan Report was a study on African-American families, and it talked about the problems with African-American families. It talked about the idea that you had no fathers in the home, so mothers had to raise the children, which then created children whom were going to be problems. Wilson created a nuclear family in Fences in 1957. He challenged the stereotype. Now, Troy stepped outside of it. He doesn't forgive Troy for doing it, and no one else does either. He's not asking you to forgive. Troy didn't ask you to forgive him for it. But what it is he still keeps that family structure together. So fences becomes both a protest and an examination of one particular cross-section of the culture. Now, the idea of suppression or repression brings in that psychocultural, psychosocial dynamic in fences. Remember, we're talking about a group of individuals, particularly our main character, so to speak, Troy, who has lived a very, very interesting life, if we could put it this way, right? How do we learn, or when do we learn about from whence Troy comes, how Troy comes into being? And I'm not saying from birth, but how the big hint 14-year-old Troy finds himself forced into manhood. Now let's talk about it through that lens. What's traumatic about that break between not only that father and son, right? But that experience of being forced into manhood at 14 and then walking away and walking yourself along with a group of people up to the north. So we're talking about this idea, these fences around, these physical fences, but we have these psychological fences. We have these emotional fences, right? And take it a step further, if I may suggest, is that Troy's fence is constructed of wood that's just as hard as that wood that Corey is showing Bono that he can saw through. So we have Wilson using the idea of the human and I guess you could say the natural, the physical idea. Troy's fence is there. So Troy has to build a fence, but Troy has already walled himself up to understanding or misunderstanding, right? Now, the idea of the moral ambiguity is extremely important, particularly when we talk about the idea of cultural retentions or cultural practices, right? Troy's sense of understanding what a man is supposed to do or a father is supposed to do is that one R word that he uses throughout the play. What's that?
Responsibility.
Exactly. And he creates his own connotation of responsibility, doesn't he? So what you all need to think about when you're writing about this or thinking about moral ambiguity, how we have one denotation of responsibility, but how Troy creates his own understanding of responsibility, and it becomes one that we may not necessarily agree with. However, when you know his story, because his story is suppressed. Remember, he doesn't talk about that until he and Bono and Lyons are in the yard participating in their Friday ritual. And remember, Lyons said, "Oh, Dad, you never told me that story." So Lyons is now 34 years old and doesn't know from whence his father comes. And I'm not saying from Alabama, but I'm saying understanding what that means. So we see how Lyons is very much like Troy in a sense because he's stubborn, he's selfish, he doesn't want to give up being a jazz musician. Troy doesn't want to give up Alberta because he can laugh in her house. Rose is not giving up her house. Corey does yield and gives up his dream of going to college because his father won't sign the papers for him to go, but he doesn't let that hold him back. He joins the Marines. Lyons is determined to live on his own until he becomes too sick and he has to be committed then to the asylum. So we do have them restrained, but they also still live up to what they want to live up to, right, eventually. So each of them construct their own fences and they cross their own fences and they bring people in the way they want to. So fences becomes even larger of a metaphor that we're working with this. Excellent, excellent. Going back to sins of the father. Now that we've used the terms trauma, now that we've understood how Troy has come to be, now we've understood what he suppressed all these years. By the play's end, did anyone empathize with Troy as a character? Did you? Not to say, I didn't say forgive, I said empathize, because there's a difference. No, not really. I think that's fair because I think once you go back, as you've done with Ghost, and you look at how all these works, going back to universality, right? How these works work together, how several of the books that I know that you all have read who have interesting father figures or male figures, I can empathize with, but I don't forgive. I can understand what creates them. I can understand how they come about, but I don't forgive, right? So I think the idea of empathy, though, is what we move to as humanists. This is what we move to when we teach you literature. We want you to understand that it could be even the worst character, but there is still that iota of humanity that is there. So Wilson doesn't necessarily create Troy to be redeemed. I mean, he dies. And we never see him tell Rose, I'm sorry, do we? He doesn't get to reconcile with Corey. Not physically anyway, right? It becomes a spiritual reconciliation when Corey has to realize, I have to forgive my father, because if not, I'm going to continue that same sin. Each generation has an opportunity to be better. Troy is still better than his father, isn't he? He may be verbally abusive or emotionally distant, and he is physically abusive with Corey. But it becomes when he feels as though he's threatened, his sense of understanding, his connotation of what it means to be there. Going back to Troy and Corey, one of the other key scenes, and of course I know you all talked about this, or should have talked about this, or we'll talk about this more, is that standoff. Very simply, why don't you like me? It doesn't matter. I've been teaching this play for 20 years. And for 20 years, I still always kind of shirk at that scene. Because if either one of my children ever asked me that, it would be painful for me. But I understand, and maybe I can help you understand Troy's response. It's harsh, isn't it? It's cruel. He says, he instead of using love at all, it's like, I'm responsible for you. Who puts clothes on your back? Who gives you school clothes? All those things add up. He never says, oh, I do like you, right? He never says, I love you. But Troy probably never heard those words either. I mean, every time I read that scene, I also think about my own father, about Morgan's grandfather, whom I love dearly, but I don't think I ever heard my father ever say that he loved me. But I never felt that I wasn't loved, because that was his way. He has a quiet way. He was a demonstrator. My family, my parents were married for 20 years. They literally did not divorce until I went to college. And that was a decision they made amongst themselves. And when they told me it was a decision they made amongst themselves, you know, it made perfect sense, because they were determined that my brother and I were going to be okay. And we were okay. But I still, to this day, have never heard, and I don't hold it against them, because my father's father never told him he loved him. Now, I'm sharing that with you all not to, put any of us on the spot, but to say that's why I can understand fences, because when you pull back those layers about how these kind of historical patterns continue throughout families, and that's universal. It's like passed down by those generational curses, and this isn't even a curse. This is about, how do I do this? So Corey has the opportunity to be one step better than his father, because he's learned now that he's just like his father. So Fences pulls us in. It's draining. When you finish reading the play, you're drained, because you're like, what do I do? But the beautiful part of it is that we have two rays of hope in Fences. So I go to the ray of hope I will tell you about that and that's Raynell. When it comes to the idea of Raynell, Wilson is very deliberate. Raynell comes into the family amidst chaos, doesn't she? I mean, she is now Troy's third child, who's been conceived outside of wedlock, who he's, and one thing he does, going back to the excellent point that's being made, he's responsible, isn't he? He doesn't leave Raynell with her now deceased mother's family. He brings her to his house, and that's when he has to make a choice. No, Rose doesn't even give him a chance to make a choice. I'm taking this baby, but you're done. And she raises Raynell as though Raynell were her own. So when we meet Raynell for the first time, really, at the play's conclusion, at his funeral, what I want you all to think about is how Raynell really is a ray of hope for that whole family. Raynell, the innocent babe who comes in by, these means that are not innocent, actually gives Rose another chance to be a better mother, and to make certain that Raynell will not commit the sins of the mother. You have that? She's not going to allow Raynell to allow herself to allow a man to consume her. Also, Troy is gone, I'm coming. But Raynell is still there. I do this to my students all the time. I'm like, write it down because I'm going to forget, or you're going to forget. Raynell is still the person, especially when she sings that song with Corey at the end. And she's like, oh, you remember the song Papa used to sing about his old dog Blue? It's not just a cute moment, you all. It's the idea of bringing that family back together. And the irony of it is, it's an individual who really caused one of the most chaotic moments in the family. The last thing I want to say is that Wilson does something very interesting if you ever have the opportunity to read all of his plays collectively. Usually the individuals who are that ray of hope, or who are the purveyors of the future, or the next generation, are female children. It's a very deliberate act on his part, although he said he didn't write women well. And I keep thinking, well, who wrote Rose? Because I don't know what you're doing here. Although he never, one thing he never ever said that he was a feminist writer. He's like, I only know the world of black men, this is what I write about. But every time he wrote a black male character, he wrote a female character who was just as powerful. But he never claimed to say that I can write women well. Remember I told you all about Jim of the Ocean, the first play that begins it? Jim of the Ocean has a character by the name of Aunt Esther. He actually puts the titular character, or the main character of his whole cycle, to be a female character. But he didn't write women well. But his legacies are female children. He has 2 daughters. But because he recognizes, particularly when it comes to writing about male culture, that male culture cannot exist without the female voice. And also that women are the venue through which the next generation is created. So he has these battles between these males and these females, these tensions. He wants you to understand that the culture, the African American culture, cannot sustain itself lopsidedly. It needs both. So he's working through those power dynamics. And he's working through them both in a literary sense, in a dramatic sense, but also for him in a therapeutic sense, because Wilson was married 3 times. And he'll admit the first 2 marital faults were his own. His wife, Costanza, who inherited the whole estate and who is now the executive of his estate now, particularly the way the plays are being produced, is the one he credits with. He finally came into his manhood to understand how to do this. So a lot of his work is personal. A lot of it is there because he's talking about himself as part of this culture.